Vladimir Putin, Russia's 21st century Tsar, is poised to return to the Kremlin and dominate Russian politics for a generation. But what kind of motherland does he want to build? At home, Putinism is being challenged as never before by an urban protest movement. On the international stage, Russia stands accused of siding with the enemies of freedom. My guest today is longtime Putin aide and spokesman Dmitry Peskov. Is Putin's Russia willing or able to change with the times? Dmitry Peskov in Moscow, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you.
If I may, I want to start with an issue which is pressing upon everybody in the international community, and that is Syria. You're a man who understands the power of the image. It doesn't look good, does it, for Russia to be Syria's main arms supplier when we see Syria's security forces turning their guns on their own civilian population?
Well, first of all, you're asking a question that I simply cannot answer because Prime Minister, and Putin is still Prime Minister of the Russian Federation, and I'm a spokesman to a Prime Minister, and that's why we're not involved in foreign politics. This is a privilege of our President, our head of state. But nevertheless, I can assure you that Russia is doing nothing that can be treated as a violating international law. And certainly, it shouldn't bother international community when a country is standing on its own domestic interests. This is the premier goal of every country, actually. Yes,
I mean, I understand your point about, of course, being spokesman for the Prime Minister at the current time. But nonetheless, you know, in the last couple of months, we've seen Vladimir Putin, your boss, speak out on a range of international issues, including Syria and Iran, which is why I want to ask you about them. So if I may just pursue...
That was during the campaign in his capacity as a candidate.
Yes, indeed. And obviously every Russian and everybody around the world knows he's very soon going to be Russian president again. So it is rather important to pin down exactly what he believes is going on in Syria right now. So if I may persist with that just for a moment, when it comes to the weapons, are you suggesting to me that when he is back in the Kremlin, when he's president again, he will continue what has been a massive increase in Russia's arms supplies to Syria that we've seen over the last 4 years?
Well, first of all, certainly with coming of a new president, when he becomes a president again, Russia's foreign policy will continue in its basics, in its essence. Well, because Russia is a serious state, and it cannot change its foreign politics once in 10 years or once in 5 years. So that's why the basics of the foreign policy of the Russian, I have no doubt, will be continued after Putin becomes a president.
Yeah, Mr. Putin told the Times newspaper just the other day that there wasn't, in his view, a special relationship between the Russian government and Mr. Assad, Bashar al-Assad. How would you characterize the relationship between the Russian government and the Assad regime?
Well, first of all, Assad regime is a legitimate regime, and he's a legitimate president of a country. He's legitimate president of Syria, and he's taking care of his citizens. And discussing any acts of terror, let's say from one side, we have to treat the situation in balance. We have to tackle both sides, and we shouldn't forget that Assad is taking care of its citizens, and Assad is responsible for law and order assurance in Syria, and certainly. We have no reason in order not to believe that he's taking measures in order to ensure these laws and orders.
Well, how many Syrian civilians would have to die at the hands of Syria's security forces before you would no longer describe Bashar al-Assad as the legitimate leader of Syria?
Well, listen, I don't think that I can really discuss, that I can dive into discussion on this issue. But at the same time, we have to remember, saying that, you have to remember victims of those terrorists who are acting in certain cities of Syria. So you should treat situation from both angles.
Sure, but I'm sure you are more aware than I am, because I know you follow this very closely, that by the time there was any significant Syrian rebel resistance, the UN had already declared that more than 2,700 Syrians had been killed, and those had been killed by the security forces loyal to Bashar al-Assad. I know you know that, so it's not a conflict where there are two equal sides.
Well, I have to repeat that. Unfortunately, I wish I could have time. I wish I could have time and possibilities for watching this situation more closely, as you say. But being a spokesman to a prime minister, we have to be more closely to domestic issues, to economic issues, investments issues, especially while we're all living in a very turbulent economic environment, globally wide.
I take the point. You've got many responsibilities. Of course, one of them is to nurture Russia's image on the international stage. We've seen Russia exercise its Security Council veto twice now when it comes to resolutions regarding Syria. That led the US ambassador to describe Russia's actions, alongside China, it has to be said, as disgusting and shameful. So there is a real problem here in your relations with the West and the international community, isn't there, over Syria?
Well, pursuing your own interests is not a problem in your relationship with Western community, and we sincerely hope that international community well, actually, we cannot speak about international community as a whole. That some Western countries would treat our position with understanding. Certainly, we cannot tolerate the statements, well, assessing our position, as you have mentioned above. We totally disagree with this assessment, but nevertheless, I have no doubt that the Russian Federation will continue to stand on its own national interests.
Let me ask you perhaps a wider and more principled question, and this in a way relates not just to your time representing Mr. Putin as Prime Minister, but going back to your association with him when he was President as well. Because I remember well, and of course you do, that in 2005 the UN General Assembly adopted this notion, this principle of a responsibility to protect. The idea that no nation could stand on its sovereignty and use that as a justification for crimes against humanity, war crimes within its own borders, and expect the rest of the international community to stand by and watch it happen. Russia did back that notion. Has Russia decided that was a mistake?
You mean mistake what?
A mistake to adopt the idea of a responsibility to protect, because it strikes me that if you're serious about a responsibility to protect, you should be applying that principle now in Syria, not just you, but nations around the world.
Well, as a matter of fact, I mean, we have to differ. We have to differ a sovereignty of the country with any possible crimes against humanity. First of all, we have to understand who is a judge to take a decision. What is a crime against humanity and what is not, and what could be treated as a serious evidence of that crime, and whether we are objective enough in our attitude as to put on both sides of the issue, I mean, every crimes that hypothetically could have taken place in a country. So, I mean, systematically, it's a very complicated question, and there is no need in simplifying it.
Well, I suppose it only seems simple to people on the ground in Syria. For example, the defector from the Syrian armed forces who told a BBC reporter just outside Homs that he had received orders, he and his men, to, quote, shoot at everything that moves, civilian or military, you shoot it. That is prima facie evidence, is it not, of a government which is ignoring basic international norms.
Well, but at the same time, we all have evidence about militant groups of terrorists acting in various cities of Syria. We all witnessed a couple of days ago terrible acts of terror in Syrian capital.
But Mr. Peskov, that's really not the point of my question. I mean, whether or not militant groups, as you call them, are also violating international law and norms is really neither here nor there when it comes to judging the Syrian government, the government led by President Assad.
Well, but that's actually was the point of my answer. Although you never asked about that, but I wanted to answer that way. And what I want to say to you is that international community is tackling this issue very closely. And Russia is a responsible part of international community, and it will stay together with the international community in solving these problems. We hope that international mission that is entitled to mediate through solving this problem will have a positive results, and Russia is ready to do its utmost to assist in that. But Russia is not ready to betray its own interests and to betray interests of international law. Certainly Russia would never be ready to agree that a group of countries can do judgments, international judgments, instead of international community. This is what Russia would strongly disagree, would continue to strongly disagree.
All right. Of course, we can't look at Syria in isolation. It comes as one part of a series of turbulent times across the Middle East. Some call it the Arab Spring. I mean, we saw in Libya last year a Russian government which was adamantly opposed to NATO military intervention, which was based upon UN Security Council Resolution 1973. I think your boss, Mr. Putin, called it a medieval crusade call not so long ago. Is it indeed the case that as a result of what happened with the intervention, Western-led intervention in Libya, Russia does now suspect any UN Security Council move across the world, frankly, but particularly in the Middle East, which appears to the Russians to authorize any sort of intervention? Are you deeply suspicious of that?
Well, Russia would like to avoid a situation when a wording of resolution is not sharp enough to avoid misusing of this resolution.
And you
I think, well, if you agree with me, this is quite an unaffordable statements for, actually, I mean, for in terms of foreign policy, for a press secretary of a Russian prime minister.
Well, it's not for me to agree or disagree with your words. I'm just trying to get, in a way, I'm trying to get inside the mindset of the Russian government and your boss, Vladimir Putin, in particular. For example, late February, he wrote that, quote, the West has shown too much willingness to punish certain countries. Again, he seems to be characterizing what is happening and the calls for intervention in various countries as somehow part of a sort of Western plot to expand its power and influence.
Well, we all have international law, and we're all members of international law system, of current international law system that we're living in. And we have the United Nations and United Nations Security Council. The humankind has never invented yet something more responsible for international stability and international security. So that means that we all have to stick to certain rules. And definitely we all have to avoid let's say, situations, as I said before, that a couple of countries or a group of countries tends to take a responsibility for ensuring security instead of international bodies entitled.
Right. You see, it just leaves me a little bit confused, moving away from Syria to Iran for a moment, leaves me a little confused about what the Russian position really is. And I know you're going to tell me you're the spokesman for the Prime Minister, not the President, but nonetheless, this again goes back to the time when Putin was president, in the sense that back in 2006, Russia for the first time decided to support the first limited sanctions against Iran for its pursuit of its nuclear ambitions in a way that the international community felt violated certain international regulations. Russia has supported 3 more rounds of limited sanctions since then, but at the very same time, Vladimir Putin in recent times has said on no account would he ever support any military intervention to thwart Iran acquiring a nuclear bomb. So I'm just a little confused about what Russia really wants to happen in Iran.
Well, Russia wants to see Iran being in a very close interaction and cooperation with international bodies, including IAEA, in monitoring the Iran's nuclear program, that we don't have any doubt about right now that this program is of peaceful nature. So, and
yeah, but you are supporting the UN sanctions against Iran, so you clearly have problems with the way the Iranians are handling it, but you're at the same time saying, well, even if they were to acquire a bomb, we would never countenance any military-based intervention to thwart them.
Well, listen, we are living well in the same region with Iran. I mean, the Russian Federation, and definitely we would rather want to see stable, peaceful states next to our borders, and we would never want to see a region teared apart by war activities next to our borders. This is our main goal. To use every possible diplomatic and political means that are at hand to solve the problem, and not playing muscles at every occasion.
Yeah, not playing muscles or flexing muscles. That's something you've accused the Americans and Western allies of doing inside your own country as well. Because if we can turn now to domestic politics in Russia.
That's great.
Yeah, I just wondered when Vladimir Putin accused demonstrators in the period after the Duma elections in December, when he accused demonstrators of essentially being in the pay of the West, quote, unacceptable when foreign money is being pumped into our election process. What evidence did he have?
All reliable and necessary evidence.
What?
And only possessing this evidence is a reason for making such responsible statements.
Yeah, and what's the evidence? I mean, you know, again, we must defend our sovereignty from interference from abroad. What precise evidence, facts can you bring to me which show that the United States was leading an effort to interfere with your sovereignty?
Well, United States was never hiding the process of financing some public organizations here involved in domestic politics. I think you would rather agree with me that this situation is totally impossible somewhere in England or in the United States, that, for example, Russia is supporting financially some organizations involved in domestic political process. It is totally out of possibility. But Washington never hides this fact, and they are doing it officially, and so it's not a secret.
Yeah, of course, the way you characterize the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations that work in Russia, helping to inculcate values of democracy without any sort of sense of partisan involvement, I just wonder why you are so fearful of these groups.
Well, we're not so fearful. We're not so fearful, but definitely when Putin said that words that you have mentioned, he never meant that all of the people who took part in that actions of protest, that they are being financed. He meant that there are certain NGOs, that there are certain personalities that are being sponsored from abroad, being sponsored in order to trigger the situation, in order to provoke the situation, in order to provoke the unrest. And his main purpose was actually to warn people against being a toy, being an instrument in the hands of those NGOs and personalities.
Yeah, I use
because at the end, all that people are our citizens, and no one tends
they're
to
your
differ
citizens, and you do tend to lock them up if they protest too loudly, even after Mr. Putin's resounding victory in the presidential election, you're still locking people up for, quote-unquote, addressing a crowd without permission. That would apply to Sergei Udaltsov. You've also, again, moved against Navalny, Alexei Navalny. There are other protesters also facing new charges. What, again, this word fearful, why? Why are you so frightened of people who criticize Putin and Russia's current political system?
No, we're not. We're not. I think now you produce a classical example of misunderstanding. So I would rather say that in this case you're a victim of propaganda of those people, also of the people that you have mentioned right now. Actually, no one is afraid of them.
Well, why do you lock them up then?
And they can use,
if you're not afraid of them,
because they violate law. There is a law in this country.
By addressing a crowd.
And if you violate the law, if you gather the crowd, and if you start to address the crowd in a way that contradicts the law and regulations, you have to be locked out.
Do you think
this is very simple?
Yeah. Do you think in Mr. Putin's third presidential term he's going to have to address again something of an image problem? While the courts are so quick to stamp out the sort of dissidents that we see from people like Mr. Navalny, we have others, those senior officials suspected of involvement, for example, of involvement in the death in custody of Sergei Magnitsky, the lawyer, who walk the streets of Moscow entirely free. The courts don't seem very keen to tackle them.
Well, no, it is being tackled. It is being tackled, and then, by the way, Mr. Navalny enjoyed the freedom of expressing his views on legal, during legal activities, during legal actions of protest, and no one made any obstacles. No one took him in custody. I mean, he was free to do that, and he enjoyed it for 100%. I hope you would recall that. I think
Mr. Navalny's seen the back of a prison van more than once, and you know it.
Well, that means that he attempted to violate the law more than once.
But get back to my other point, that while the courts are so eager to use the full force of the law against people like him, the corruption, the endemic corruption that so many Russians, and I think you would acknowledge this, so many different Russians, NGOs, international analysts and Russians themselves talk of, isn't being tackled at all.
It is. It is a serious problem for our society, for our system, and we all have to fight this corruption. We all have to fight it systematically. And the attention of the president, of the prime minister, that is being devoted to this problem, actually, is the best proof that we're determined to combat it.
Well, except that Mr. Medvedev used those words 4 years ago when he got the presidency. He said he was going to be absolutely ruthless and determined in his pursuit of corruption, rooting it out, and he hasn't. Well, he had 4 years to do it, and Transparency International currently rates you alongside Nigeria as the 143rd worst, most corrupt country in the world.
Well, those are very strange guys. I'm not sure that the criteria that they use for making these tables is not good. Actually, is not proper. So I'm not sure whether this criteria is operatable or not.
Just before we get in, we must end in a minute. I just want a couple of brief thoughts. I mentioned Mr. Medvedev there. He is supposed to take over as prime minister when Putin takes over as president. Will that indeed happen?
Well, I can only recall the recent words of Prime Minister Putin, who had acknowledged his intention to nominate, after he becomes a president, to nominate Mr. Medvedev for prime ministership.
Right, so we can assume that still will happen. And then final thought, he has 6 years now, Mr. Putin, back in the presidency. Would you accept that he looks more vulnerable now than he did the last time he won election to the presidency? The aura of invincibility has gone. Would you accept that?
No. I would rather no. And I will explain you why. Actually, he's got about 64%. It's more than a confidence vote for a politician in our time.
All right.
So he enjoys an overwhelming support of society.
All right, we have to end there. Dmitry Peskov, I'm sorry I have to cut you off. We have to end there. Thank you very much for being on Hard Talk. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Bye.